everybody. Today's Parsha, of course, is Parshas Korach. So basically, it's been pointed out that this part of the book of Bamidbar, everything seems to be falling apart. Last week we had the story of the spies that resulted in the Jewish people being condemned to wander in the desert for 40 years. And now we have the rebellion of Korach, which almost precipitated the annihilation of the Jewish nation as a whole, but instead God limited the punishment, the retribution, to the ground opening up, swallowing Korach and Dasan V'Aviram, other troublemakers, and the 250 Nisiim who brought incense to take the place of Aaron were destroyed by a fire coming from God, which consumed them. Now, it's interesting that Korach's rebellion is often described as the democratic rebellion of common sense. Because Korach is essentially an anarchist, at least in theory, where Korach says we don't need rules, we don't need leaders, we don't need authorities to tell us what God's will is. Kol ho'edah kulam kedoshim. Everybody is holy. Everybody heard God say at Mount Sinai, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. So Korach is really calling for the abolition of hierarchy. But indeed, as is often the case, this is a very interesting political parsha, as is often the case with politicians who call for egalitarianism, it is really simply a power grab so that they will take the place of the existing leadership. Because we actually find, the way Rashi brings a number of midrashim, that Korach was actually jealous of the fact that a certain leadership position in the tribe of Levi that should have gone to him went to somebody else. So it's funny that he's using the vocabulary of we're all equal to kind of mean, therefore, I should be in charge instead of somebody else. This is the famous hidden agenda behind many revolutions. Many of you might remember George Orwell's Animal Farm, which was his parody, besides 1984, which is long past, but this was his parody of the Russian Revolution, in which the animals rebel against the oppression of the human beings, but eventually some of the animals become as dictatorial, if not more so, than the people that they replaced. Think about Robespierre, think about Phnom Penh, the whole long history of revolutions. Some say the United States Revolution, the American Revolution might be a noble exception. Some say not. Even there, people debate. But this notion of the hidden agenda, that those who are calling to upset the established order are really often concerned much more for their own power than they are for the true equality of man, is really a very, very common feature, and it emerges quite clearly in the Korach story. Now, there is one person who two people who saw through this. Moshe Rabbeinu, who deliberately said to Korach, don't you have enough glory? So Moshe understood this was about glory. And the other person who understood it is a very obscure character who does not even have a direct reference in the Torah, and this is Mrs. On ben Peles. Now, who is On ben Peles? Korach gathered to himself a bunch of malcontents. Dasan, Aviram, 250 heads of tribes who wanted positions of authority, and then it mentions an obscure person who's only mentioned once in the whole Torah, a man called On ben Peles from the tribe of Reuven. Now, later, when the Torah describes the ground opening up and people being swallowed, and some people being destroyed by fire, it doesn't mention that On ben Peles was destroyed. It mentions the other people. So Chazal give us a whole backstory here, and they say that On ben Peles' wife understood that this is a story that would not end very well for her husband. So when Korach and Dasan V'Aviram were going to various people to solicit their participation in this rebellion against Moshe, so she wanted to prevent them from entering their home, so she uncovered her hair. It's very fascinating. Even if you're a Korach, even if you're engaged in rebellion, you're not going to enter the house if a married woman's hair is uncovered. And she scared them away. And she told her husband, essentially, as good wives will often do, you are really an idiot, because you will be a loser no matter which way this contest comes out. If Moshe wins, you're in deep trouble. And if Korach wins, it'll just be replacing one boss with another boss. You're not, right? Owen Ben Pelas comes home very enthusiastic. Wow, every man a king. This was, well, just to give you an example, this was the saying of Huey Long. I don't know how conversant all of you are with the American politics of the Depression, but in the 1930s, there was really a demagogue governor of Louisiana, Huey Long, who really, he was assassinated eventually, but he was really creating a power base, and there was perhaps a certain risk that this could have been a fascist type of president eventually, similar to Hitler without the anti-Semitism. And Huey Long's motto was, every man a king. So Owen Ben Pelas is essentially coming home with all this enthusiasm. Korach says, we're all holy, we're all going to be leaders. And his wife says, again, you're an idiot. That's not the way it's going to work. Either way, you're going to be a nobody. You'll either be a nobody under Moshe or a nobody under Korach. Why are you getting involved? So she didn't use religious argumentation. She didn't use philosophical reasons. She simply used pragmatic reasons. The alleged goals of this revolution are bogus and fraudulent, and you might as well not get involved. And the Gemara tells us that indeed she saved her husband's life and reputation, and that is why Owen Ben Pelas was not punished in the rebellion against Korach. He simply withdrew his participation. And the Gemara compares Korach's wife to Owen Ben Pelas' wife. Korach's wife goaded him on, and Owen Ben Pelas' wife got him out of all of this. So it's very, very interesting, this notion of the hidden agenda. It's very relevant even today, maybe, especially today, with all sorts of political campaigns in which the various promises and the various assurances and goals that are being set are often pretenses to naked power. And again, it's sometimes very scary how much a person is willing to compromise their values, if there are any values, just to have power. In a way, it's almost illogical, because one would think in a truly moral person, power is a means, it's not an end. I mean, you have power to do certain things. But if you're going to compromise those things in order to get the power, then the power becomes an end and not a means. And then it's simply all about ego and the like. Right? So that's, I think, one very important lesson that we see from the Parsha of Korach. But to take it in a bit of a Kabbalistic turn for a moment, there's a very enigmatic statement of the Arizal, which focuses on gematrias, and the Arizal does not explain this. But he makes the following interesting numerical comparison. He says the gematria of Korach is 308. And the gematria of Moshe is 345. The difference between 345 and 308 is 37, and 37 is the gematria of Hevel. So we essentially have three gematrias here. Moshe is 345, Hevel is 37, and Korach is 308. So if you play with the mathematics here, Moshe minus Hevel equals Korach, or Korach plus Hevel equals Moshe. The Ari offers no commentary, no explanation to what any of this means, so it's open to a variety of interpretations. So let me share with you a very interesting interpretation of a great Hasidic master, the Shem Mishmuel. Shem Mishmuel's father was also a very, very great Gadol and Posek, as well as Hasidic Rebbe, the Avnei Neja, the Sachachover Rebbe, and the Shem Mishmuel was the son and successor of the Sachachover Rebbe. It's an interesting sefer because it is one of the Sfarim that if people are interested in Chasidus and they're not really initiates, so this is kind of for a basic level, Shem Mishmuel is one of the beginning Hasidic Sfarim that are recommended for people. That, Nasiba Shalom, it's a little easier than some other Hasidic Sfarim. And the Shem Mishmuel says the following. The Arizal was very big into reincarnation, right? The idea that our neshamas comes back multiple times. people often ask, is a belief in what is called Gilgul, Gilgul is reincarnation, is that an article of faith? Meaning, if you don't believe in Gilgul, are you an apikoros? Are you a heretic? So again, I just want to make it very, very clear that the concept of Gilgul is not mentioned in the Talmud. So one cannot assume it's an absolute article of faith. It really was developed by the Kabbalists. Now again, that doesn't mean it's not true. In many, many ways, we would assume that the Kabbalistic understanding of the inner dynamics of the universe would indicate that it is true. Again, on the other hand, as great an authority as Rav Sadia Gaon denied the legitimacy of reincarnation. And be sure you don't confuse reincarnation with the eventual resurrection of the dead. Those are two different processes. All Jewish thinkers within the halachic tradition believe there will be a physical resurrection of the dead at the end of days. But that's not the same thing as the transmigration of souls coming into different bodies. Nevertheless, this was a cornerstone of the Arizal's teachings, and his famous students, who really was his Boswell. The Ari wrote almost nothing. So everything we have of the Ari's teachings has come down through the writings of Rav Chaim Vital. So when people talk about Kitvei Ha'ari, they are really talking about the Ketavim of Rav Chaim Vital, which in itself went through many, many, many rewritings and additions and etc., some of which he buried and some of which he burnt and some of which was retrieved from his grave. So the whole publication of Rav Chaim Vital's explanations of the Arizal is very, very murky and very, very complicated. But one of Rav Chaim Vital's Svarim, which gives us the Ari's teachings, is called Shar HaGilgulim, the book of reincarnations, in which he identifies all sorts of people that are reincarnations of other people. Let me give you one quick example, which is not our main topic. He makes the point that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the great Tana, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, was a reincarnation of Shmuel, the prophet. And he says, and this is the meaning of the famous passage that we have in the Haggadah, which is a Mishnah, behold, I am like a person that is, remember, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, behold, I am like a person that is 70 years old, and I did not merit to know that you have to talk about the Exodus at night until Ben Zoma gave us that teaching. Now, why does Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say I am like a person that's 70? So the Gemara explains, he became the head of the Sanhedrin as a result of Rabbi Gamliel being deposed because of a disagreement with Rabbi Yoshua, but he was only 18 years old, people wouldn't respect him, so lo and behold, his beard turned white, so he would have the appearance of an older man, and people would respect him, and that, the Gemara says, is the meaning of the words, behold, I am like a person of 70 years old. Of course, my wife...
Shmuel died at 52.
That's right. So the Arizal writes that because Shmuel HaNavi died at 52, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was born with a soul that had already spent 52 years on earth. So when he was 18, his neshama had spent 70 years on earth. Harei Kaven Shivim Shana. By the way, in terms of the Gemara, that his beard turned white because he needed to look prematurely old so people would respect him. My wife always likes to interpret it a little differently. She says he turned old because of the responsibility that he was given that made him prematurely turn gray. And she always reminds me that all of our friends who did not enter the rabbinate still have, if they have beards, they still have dark beards. And I'm a little more gray than some of my friends who are the same age or even a little older. Okay, but that's what happens. Anyway, so reincarnation is a very big yesod, and in fact, the Arizal writes, most of us are not new souls. It is very rare that a new soul comes into the world these days. We are all recycled in various ways because we have to keep on coming back till we finish our mission. Now, what's a little unusual is we don't know what that mission is necessarily, and we don't necessarily have a memory of those past lives, and the whole science of past life regression is not really fully substantiated, but Gilgul we are. So now, the Arizal goes further and says this. This is the Shem Shmuel elaborating. He says, if you look at the first, actually it's not the first murder, it's the second crime. The first murder in the world was Cain killing Hevel. And let's analyze their names a little bit. Chava gave them both their names. Cain comes from the term kinyan, to acquire, to own. Hevel comes from the word for breath, hevel, nothingness, steam, vapor, all of that is hevel. So the Shem Shmuel says, Cain and Hevel represent two different personality types. They are archetypes, they are prototypes of the human personality. Cain represents that aspect of man that seeks to dominate, seeks to control, seeks to rule. And that's why Cain is a lashon of kinyan. Hevel represents that aspect of humanity that is passive and humble and submissive, just like the air, just like the vapor. Now, Rav Soloveitchik applied this in a non-Kabbalistic way to an earlier distinction, not the difference between Cain and Hevel, but the account of the two stories of the creation of man. Bible scholars have raised this question for really over a century, and that is, there are two different accounts of the creation of man in Genesis 1, Bereshis Perek Aleph, and in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, we simply read, God created man and woman together. There is no reference to taking a rib. There is no reference to dirt from the ground. God created man and woman in the image of God. That is Genesis 1. Genesis 2 gives us a different story. God took dirt, and from the dirt he formed a human shape, and he breathed into that shape his divine breath. And then he saw that man was lonely and alone, and it was not good for man to be alone, so he put him asleep, and he took a part of him, and he constituted a woman. Now these are two different accounts. In Genesis chapter 1, man and woman emerge simultaneously in the image of God. In Genesis 2, first there is man, and man feels a deep existential loneliness. And God makes him from the dirt and then makes a woman. How do you reconcile these two different accounts? So the standard Bible critic says, oh, two different authors, and some sloppy editor just put them together. Right? That's how critics always understand conflicting narratives. But Rav Soloveitchik says the following. Rav Soloveitchik says, if we understand that the Torah is not here to give us a scientific or even journalistic account of creation, but everything the Torah is describing is for a moral or religious purpose. The Torah might be describing the creation of man in two different ways to allude metaphorically to the two different aspects of human personality. Meaning, which way God did it, we actually don't know. But the Torah describes two processes, because in a human personality, there are these two processes. And he called it Adam 1 and Adam 2. This is perhaps the most famous article that Rav Soloveitchik ever wrote. This is called The Lonely Man of Faith. And there it was written probably in 1940. And this is where he basically says Adam 1 represents the human being in terms of power, creativity, autonomy. And that's why it says, man is created in the image of God. It refers to my majesty and my power and my ability to affect creation. God does not want human beings to be passive and ineffectual. God doesn't want human beings to look at injustice in the world and say, God will take care of it. God says we have to be his partners. So, chapter 1 talks about man in the image of God, and it talks about man not in a helpless, lonely, dependent state, but man and woman together. come into the world with power and ability and competence and skill. So that's Adam 1 that is called majestic man. Adam 2 is called redemptive man, as man becomes aware of his limitations, his weakness, the fact that he comes from the mud, the fact that he's lonely and needy and ineffectual and needs a partner because there's a void within him. And Rav Soloveitchik says human personality needs to be a combination of majesty and subservience. Because if all you have is Adam 1, you have arrogance, hubris, a sense of conceit that you are the master of your fate. On the other hand, if all you have is Adam 2, you have passivity, quiescence. You don't do anything in the world because you simply say, God will take care of it. If you remember, one of the classic ways that slaves were kept passive in the United States was this emphasis that there's another world out there. There's the world to come. Don't worry about it. You don't have to do anything about your life in this world. In fact, Mefarshim say one of the reasons why the Torah does not emphasize the world to come is because God wants us to look at this world as the avenue in which we have to try to improve it. We can't just say, let the world go to hell because there will be this world to come. We have an obligation of tikkun olam to make this world better. So Rav Soloveitchik sees this dichotomy in the two accounts of Adam. But in truth, the Arizal saw this dichotomy a little later in Cain and Hevel. Cain represents the creative within man, the desire, because again, we can talk about ego as being a very bad thing. And in many cases, it is a very bad thing. On the other hand, it is ego that creates the skyscraper. It is ego that finds the cures for cancer and other diseases. It is ego that creates scientific discoveries. Without ego, we would essentially be passive and we would simply take things as they come. So the world needs that midah of Cain to acquire, to dominate, to control. But it has to be balanced with the humility and submission of Hevel. And the lesson of Cain v'Hevel is that when man's ego symbolically, you look at Cain v'Hevel as archetypes in the Jungian psychological sense, that when the power of man overpowers their sense of humility, it destroys the Hevel. When the Cain destroys the Hevel, there will be tragedy that will result. Okay, that's kind of the issue of the Arizal. Cain v'Hevel represent these two different forces. One is the urge for power and domination, and the other is subservience and humility. And in reality, the perfection of the human personality requires the combination of both, because each one by itself can be destructive. Now, based on this, the Arizal says, Korach was a reincarnation of Cain, that urge for power. And Korach was, in fact, a very, very gifted person. There are midrashim that talk about Korach's profound knowledge of Torah. He understood aspects of Torah that even Moshe did not fully understand. According to one view, Korach understood the secret of the red heifer, Parah Aduma, which is considered to be the most mystical mitzvah in the Torah. We'll talk about it next week. Korach was extremely wealthy. In fact, in Yiddish, there's a saying when somebody's a very, very wealthy person, Reich wie Korach, you're as rich as Korach. And Korach was rich, was intelligent, was gifted. But Korach had this urge for power. Now, the urge for power, once again, when it's a means to doing something good, it can push a person in a very good direction. But it can also destroy a person. So Korach was the reincarnation of Cain, the Arizal says. But at the other side of the coin, Moshe Rabbeinu was the reincarnation of Hevel. Why? Because if Hevel represents submission and modesty, who was the humblest of all people? Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was Anav Mikol Adam. But in Moshe Rabbeinu, unlike Korach, you see a rectification of Hevel. Because on one hand, Hevel represents humility, submission. But the problem with humility and submission is it is too passive. It doesn't accomplish in the world. In fact, even spiritually, it doesn't accomplish. Who was the inventor of the idea of bringing a korban to Hashem? Which was a wonderful thing that Hashem loved for whatever the reason exactly.
Cain.
It was Cain, not Hevel. Hevel imitated and improved, to be sure, but Hevel was not capable of innovation because passivity does not innovate. Passivity responds. Passivity can take what other people do and accept it. So Cain was an innovator even in the spiritual world. But Cain wanted to kill Hevel, destroy Hevel. So Moshe Rabbeinu got the neshama of Hevel and took the quality of humility, but still became a leader, became a manig, became an innovator. Essentially, Moshe Rabbeinu did not allow the anava of his personality to take away the responsibilities of leadership. And in that way, Moshe Rabbeinu was mitaken what Hevel had. He took the good of Hevel and he rectified that which was negative and not quite right. Right? That is how the Shem Shmuel explains the process of Gilgal in the Ari. Seen in this way, therefore, the Gematria now becomes startling, because the Gematria is making the point that in every single respect other than one, Korach and Moshe are identical. Their spiritual powers, their perception, their initiative, their capacity for leadership is exactly the same. And what distinguished Moshe from Korach? Only the quality of humility of Hevel. Korach equals Moshe minus the Hevel. Right, now you see, right? The Hevel is 37. Moshe is 345. Korach is 308. Hevel is 37. Moshe is Korach plus Hevel. Korach is Moshe minus the Hevel. In that way, Korach is actually a classic instance of what we might call Greek tragedy. As you know, the concept of tragedy in Greek literature is not simply a building falls down on somebody, that's sad, but tragedy is when you are destroyed not by something external to yourself, but when there is greatness within you, but there's a fatal flaw that prevents your greatness from being realized, and you are destroyed from within, right? That is the term Greek tragedy. Seen in this way, the tragedy of Korach was not that the ground opened up. The tragedy of Korach was greatness that was equal to Moshe Rabbeinu got destroyed because the desire for power was so all-consuming. As the old saying of Lord Acton, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now we're going to see a very similar thing, just to give you a heads up, that Bilam is in that sense very much the same. Bilam was a prophet of the Gentiles who was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. And yet Bilam also gets destroyed for those flaws that are within. Right? So Korach in that sense is a very, very tragic case. Because those are tragedies, you know. When bad things happen to people, but there was no flaw within them, they are sad. But within the Greek definition, they are not called tragic. But this would qualify as a tragic event within that definition. Now, just to bridge this over to the Haftorah, the whole story of Korach, God did a tremendous miracle, the ground opening up, to establish in a public way the definitive nature of Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron's leadership. This was something that established it. And as a result, there would no longer be In fact, what does the pasuk say? There shall no longer be someone like Korach and his congregation. Meaning, nobody can ever make the argument that Moshe Rabbeinu was not entitled to be a leader. Derech Agav, as a little aside, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz has an alternative translation of that pasuk that is very cute but a very true thought. He says that in the case of Korach, this was the only machlokas in history, he says, where one side was totally right and one side was totally wrong. In any other machlokas, there will be some truth on both sides. So when the Torah says, there shall never be again Korach and his congregation, that means that's the only time in which there's nothing right in the other side. Meaning in any machlokas, we have to learn from each other. And that is indeed a very important message in Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it's because of my American tendencies, but generally speaking, if somebody tells me something that I disagree with, so instinctively, the way I would typically talk is, I see the point that you're making, but you need to consider this. So what you're doing is, you're incorporating some aspect of legitimacy in the other person, and then you try to qualify and try to persuade. That's almost an instinctive way, I think, that an American will typically, putting aside Trump and the like, but typically, historically, that's the way Americans interact. That is not the way discussions take place in Israel. If you say something I would disagree with, and I'm an Israeli, whether it's Haredi, or it's not even a religious secular issue, it's a general personality, my response would be, you're an idiot. And your response would be to me, I'm an idiot. And the reason things never get resolved is because each side looks at the other position as totally illegitimate, stupid, foolish, destructive, evil, including all of the words, at least in the religious vocabulary, Amalek, Erev, just to add words like because it's clear, everything. Now, as a result, no one ever moves. There's never any movement that's going around here, because each one simply looks at the other person as totally illegitimate. And Rav Chaim Shmulevitz reminds us that in machloksim, at least among Jews, there will always be a kernel of truth in someone's position. And you need to find that kernel of truth. And from that kernel of truth, there can be a consensus of sorts, even if it's only to agree to disagree. There's a famous pasuk in Mishlei, I probably have mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. Shlomo HaMelech says, Kamayim hapanim el panim, kein leif ha'adam li adam. As water reflects the face that you show the water, so too the heart of one man, one human being, reflects that which you show it. And the Vilna Gaon explains, when you look at a reflecting pool of water, whatever face you show that water is the face you will see. I smile at the water, I will see a smiling face. I frown at the water, I will see a frowning face. Whatever I show the water is what I will see in the water. So too, says Shlomo HaMelech, as water reflects the face that you show it, the heart of man reflects that which you show it. I show a person respect, legitimacy. I show that person that I'm attempting to understand where they're coming from. Then they will feel the same about me. On the other hand, if my attitude is that that person has nothing to offer, there is nothing on the table that's worthwhile, then they will look at me the same way. That's why I greatly, greatly applaud, this is a person who I don't know him, but I am so enormously impressed. You may have heard of Menachem Bambach in Beitar. It's on YouTube. It's really something to see. He is a Hasidic person. He's a Chesed. He went through Hasidic chinuch all of his life. He does not have an official secular education at all. But he started a school which, number one, for Hasidic kids, Haredi kids, not Dati Lumi, not modern Orthodox, regular Haredi kids. So number one, he incorporates secular studies. Okay, that's one thing. But number two, by keeping them Hasidim, keeping them with all of the minhagim, all of the halachos that they keep, all of the hanhagos, to inculcate within the educational system a sense of respect and tolerance and appreciation for all segments of Israeli society, religious and non-religious. So the particular YouTube video was quite amazing. This was a program that he had for Hasidic children on Yom HaZikaron, which I have to say, unfortunately, is not necessarily widely observed in the Hasidic community, the Haredi community generally. And he showed these Hasidic kids with payas, regular long coats, everything. He showed them a picture of a little boy, looked like 8 years old, didn't have a kippah, wearing shorts and a t-shirt. And he was prostrated, he was lying on top of a grave. It's not clear, it probably was his father's grave. And he asked each of the children to describe what they thought the picture meant, kind of a Rorschach test. And the children were forced to talk about empathy, what this child feels, what his father had sacrificed for the Jewish people. And this was really one of the most moving things I had ever seen. Because here you have kids who, depending on the school, might never even talk to that type of Jew, in which they were genuinely learning to identify with the struggles and the feelings of a totally different segment of society, and to respect and appreciate the different sacrifices, the supreme sacrifices that Chayolim make for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel. So, as you would expect sometimes, Rabbi Bambach gets condemned for the secular studies, for the, whatever it is, the outreach to the different segments. But if the religious world would have 10 such schools in Eretz Israel, I think everything would be different. Everything would be different. The whole relationship between religious and secular, which is now fraught with so much tension, so much animosity, so much hostility, and so much fear, if that could be broken down, we would realize we're all on the same team. We all do have fundamentally a similar goal. Because, there's an old saying in military science that the biggest mistakes that generals make is when they fight the last war. Right? A general remembers the last war and develops strategies based on what worked in the last war, when in fact there are new challenges. I have to say that much of the Haredi and Hasidic world has a certain memory, and some of the memories are justified, unfortunately, of things that were done in the 40s and the 50s, where there were Zionist leaders who were, some, not all even then, who were very aggressive and openly anti-religious in some ways. And that created very, very bad residual memories, in which on one hand, the religious population was very small and very powerless. And on the other hand, there was a certain aggressive tendency to create the new Jew, not the Golos Jew, the new powerful Jew that didn't need God. And those memories linger in the collective unconsciousness of a religious population that is now very large and fully participant in power and the like. But there's still this memory of being a little kid who was picked upon by the bullies. And even when you grow up, you look at the big, big bully and you just have so much hate for them. But that's frankly not the reality. That's not the reality. Even secular leaders are by and large not anti-religious. Yair Lapid is not Tommy Lapid, father and son. It's a different type of picture. Again, I mean, should you be suspicious of? I don't want to get into politics too much. I mean, I'm not endorsing anybody on any side. But what I'm saying is that part of what goes on in the religious world is they are fighting yesterday's battles, and those battles did leave a lot of scars. I'm not denying that. but that doesn't automatically reflect the reality. So Rabbi Bambach, in that sense, is a very, very profound thinker in that way. And it was almost on his own. He came to this. Nobody taught him this. And I hope and I pray that that will be the direction that the religious community will move, because that will do wonders for religious secular relations. It'll do wonders for the state of Israel. And it will create a new commonality of Klal Yisrael that will frankly bring Mashiach. It'll bring Mashiach. It's a double punch. It'll bring Mashiach. Because if that which is Ma'akev the Geula, if that which holds back the redemption is the sinas chinam, the hatred and polarization that exists among Jews, if we can surmount that, so that's the condition for bringing the Geula. Also, I would say as well that when you get rid of those animosities, then the secular world itself is going to be much more open to religion. It's been pointed out over and over and over again that even a Chiloni Jew in Israel is much more connected to Jewish tradition than, let's say, a secular Jew in Chutz La'aretz. Number one, I mean, you can't escape it, really. You can't escape it. And a very high percentage of so-called Chilonim will light Shabbat candles, no matter what they do afterwards. Hanukkah, Pesach, Yom Kippur, many, many things. Brit Milah, all of these things. And if there's a sense that they too are accepted and legitimated and welcomed and befriended, then they would be open to all sorts of things. You know, you never really know what's going to happen. So, again, you should check out Rabbi Bamba, the YouTube videos. I think they're really a very, very exciting new development in Eretz Yisrael.
How would you search under his name, Bambach?
Just Bambach, yeah, Bombach. Yeah, you Google that name, you'll see a lot of things. In fact, it's been picked up in newspapers. There's a lot of newspaper stories about it.
Or in yesterday's Sunday's Jerusalem Post, there was a very moving article about Rabbi Bambach and his work in Beitar Eli.
Yes.
Written by Dov Lippman.
By Dov Lippman, yeah. So Dov Lippman, I don't know if you know this, Dov Lippman grew up in my community. I remember him as a little boy. Yeah, I know his parents very, very well. So, so when people, sometimes in some of the circles I'm in, people will talk, oh, did you see what Dov Lippman did? You know, etc. But the truth of the matter is, I agree with almost everything Dov Lippman did, and maybe it was a little premature, maybe it was before the time, you know, that things have a certain ripening and the like. But yeah, certainly he would be a person that would strongly endorse Rabbi Bambach's work. The problem is there are not enough of them, because, you know, we read story after story of people throwing rocks or spitting or abusing, whether it's little girls or chayolim. But we have to know there is another side to that story, and hopefully that other side will eventually become dominant and be the main idea. Now, just to switch over to the Haftorah, if the Parsha itself is about establishing authority to prevent dissension, so the Haftorah deals with a parallel story. You know, we talked about last week the idea of Shaul becoming a king. And Shmuel was against the idea of a monarchy, but once the people wanted it, he gave them a monarchy. But, interestingly enough, at a later time, Shmuel did a ceremony, you might call it a coronation ceremony, called Chidush HaMlucha. And why there was a need for a Chidush HaMlucha is not entirely clear, but apparently Shmuel himself needed to show that he was fully supportive. Once there's a monarch, he will fully support it because of all of the opposition he expressed earlier. So Shmuel created a coronation ceremony called Chidush HaMlucha in order to dispel any people who would argue that Shaul's Malchus was illegitimate because God did not want them to have a king. Right? So the parallel to Korach is that the opening up of the ground was the coronation ceremony for Moshe. Shmuel had a coronation ceremony for Shaul to establish Shaul's authority. Now, what I wanted to talk about in our remaining time are just a few different aspects of this. And that is, the first king of Israel was Shaul HaMelech. Shaul is, of course, from the tribe of Binyamin. And one of the big questions that the commentaries raise is that when Yaakov Avinu was on his deathbed in Parshas Vayechi, so Yaakov gave a bracha to the tribe of Yehuda in recognition of Yehuda's superiority as leader. And Yaakov said, Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda u'mechokek mi bein raglav. The scepter of authority shall not be taken away from Yehuda. And this is interpreted by Rambam to mean that God is declaring that monarchy within the Jewish people must come through the tribe of Yehuda. Now later it became David, it got narrowed, but at least initially, all Malachim must come from Shevet Yehuda. Ad Kedei Kach that the Ramban writes that all of the kings of the 10 tribes were in violation of Yaakov's blessing because those kings were from the tribe of Ephraim. The Ramban then goes on and says that the Chashmonaim, who established a monarchy after the overthrow Antiochus, they shouldn't have done it. They should not have become kings. They should have, after they achieved a military victory, they should have looked from someone from Yehuda because of Lo Yasser Shevet Mi Yehuda. So the question becomes, if this is indeed halachically a requirement, that monarchy, the royal family, so to speak, must be from Yehuda, how could there have been a Malchut Shaul in the first place? And after all, it was God that chose Malchut Shaul. Why didn't God choose David HaMelech? Maybe he was too young, but somebody from the tribe of Yehuda. So there are a number of interesting answers to this question. The Rambam himself says that since the Jewish people at that time were requesting a monarch for illegitimate reasons, and God was not happy with their motivation, they wanted to be like all of the nations, etc. So God deliberately gave them a malchut that was doomed to fail, because permanent monarchy only belongs to Yehuda. Any other monarchy would, by definition, be ephemeral and temporary. And since their motivations for wanting a king were improper, God gave them a temporary, ephemeral malchut. There's a lot of kashas on this, because that means, according to Rambam, Shaul's malchut was intended to fail from the very beginning. It was never meant to last. That's what the Rambam says. The problem is, that seems to be contradicted by the narrative in the book of Shmuel, when Shaul loses the malchut because he failed to kill Amalek. So Shmuel says to him, had you been faithful to the word of Hashem, you would have sat on the throne of Israel forever and ever and ever, and you are losing it because of your sin. I think that is a contradiction to the Rambam's idea that this was ephemeral malchut. Let me offer a second explanation, which is, again, political, but I think it may have a certain validity. Again, going back to American history, I apologize for the non-Americans. Lincoln's vice president for his second term was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, of course, became president when Lincoln got assassinated. Andrew Johnson was a senator from Tennessee. Now, at least part of Tennessee had fought on the side of the Confederates. So why would Lincoln choose somebody from a Confederate state? So the historians tell us that because the Confederates were rebelling against the United States, Lincoln felt it necessary to show that even the former Confederacy is now part of the nation. Now, lahavdil, you can actually apply this to Shaul HaMelech. Shortly before Shmuel, there was a great, devastating civil war of all the tribes of Israel against Binyamin. Do you remember the story? This is the infamous story of the concubine, the Pilegesh Begiva. And this was a woman that her master, she was a concubine, she was not a regular wife, she was a mistress, but the one that controlled her was traveling with her through the tribe of Binyamin territory. And actually, the way he treats her also is despicable. And he basically left her outside to sleep on the porch, so to speak, and he went inside. And in the course of that evening, she was repeatedly raped and eventually murdered. He comes out in the morning, he kind of trips over her body. Again, I mean, his own behavior is extremely callous. And what he then does is, again, the whole story is filled with disgusting things. He cuts her up into 12 pieces, and he sends a piece to each of the other tribes of Israel, and says, look at what these Binyaminites did. He demanded justice in this very crude way. So what happened was that the tribes demanded what we would call today extradition of the wrongdoer to be tried. Shevet Binyamin refused to extradite. They took the interesting position. Again, it's a fascinating legal position. They took the position every tribe was a sovereign country, sovereign state. And therefore, the other tribes had no jurisdiction over Averos that were committed in Binyaminite territory. It's really the states' rights argument. Every tribe is a sovereign nation. And the entire Jewish nation waged a civil war against this one tribe of Binyamin. Now you would figure the odds were never very good for Binyamin with those numbers against them, and Binyamin was almost entirely decimated. Their population went down to 400 men. And not only that, but the people of Israel took a vow that nobody would allow anyone to marry a daughter from Binyaminites, which would mean, in other words, the tribe would eventually be extinct. Eventually, the vow was annulled and Binyamin was readmitted. So I would suggest, by analogy to Lincoln, that maybe Hashem wanted the first Melech to be B'davka from Binyamin, to show that Binyamin was re-elevated and readmitted into the Kahal Yisrael as a tribe in good standing. It would be a way of legitimating their standing, and I think that could have been perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu's cheshbon. By the way, there are some midrashim that say that a large number of Binyaminites fled from the battle and they migrated to Europe. And some even say that the British royal family somehow has some genealogical connection to the tribe of Binyamin. I'm not sure, maybe you can tell me more, but one of the royal jewels or something has some story connected to Binyaminites, and there's some type of murky legend or connection to that. So Jews are indeed all over the place in that way. But there are midrashim that say the Binyaminites did flee. Some of them fled to Europe and had in various European countries.
A similar claim has been made for the French monarchy in connection with the tribe of Yehuda, through the personality of Jesus.
Yes. Well, the Da Vinci Code, yeah. That's the Da Vinci Code story.
Yes, well, and Dan Brown picked up on that.
I know he didn't invent it, I'm saying, I know, but that's the one that got famous from
that. The specific claim is that the Merovingian dynasty in France was founded by descendants of Jesus who were smuggled out of the country.
Right. That goes back to his getting married, Mary Magdalene.
The last Jewish king was exiled into France, Agrippas II and his court.
From a Jewish king of what?
The last Jewish king, Agrippas II.
Agrippas, yes.
Was exiled with his court by the Romans
to France. That idea I wasn't aware of. To France, interesting, and very, very interesting. So there may be Jewish blood in all sorts of monarchical lines. Now, there's a third, so we have two explanations, right? The Rambam says, since their motivation was improper, so God gave them a monarchy to fail, set up to fail. Second is my political speculation, that this was a way of readmitting Binyamin into Klal Yisrael as a tribe in good standing. There is a third explanation that is offered by the Barbanel, other Mefarshim, and that is, Shaul was given one job, which he didn't fully carry out, the job to eradicate Amalek. And there is a Gemara that says Amalek can only be eradicated by the children of Rachel and not by the children of Leah. And we see this pattern throughout the Torah, that the first war against Amalek was conducted in the desert by Yehoshua ben Nun from the tribe of Ephraim, Yosef, Rachel. Shaul HaMelech is given the command to eradicate Amalek, not David HaMelech. And in fact, in David HaMelech's time, there were Amalekim, and David did not automatically take care of them. Mordechai and Esther, who are descended from Shaul, are the ones who engineered the destruction of Haman from Amalek. And finally, we have the enigmatic figure of Mashiach ben Yosef, who is supposed to come before Mashiach ben David, and the role of Mashiach ben Yosef is to finish off Amalek. So the one thing you see in common is the destruction of Amalek paves the way for Malchus Beis David, but Malchus Beis David or Malchus Beis Yehuda is not capable of destroying Amalek. Amalek must be destroyed by the Korach of Rachel and not the Korach of Leah. And that's why there needed to be a Malchut Shaul from Binyamin as a precursor to the Malchut of David HaMelech, Malchus Yehuda. Now, why that is so, once again, there are different reasons that one would give, but one of the reasons would be because Amalek comes from Esav. Amalek is Esav's grandson. And therefore Amalek represents the negative, destructive power of one brother hating another brother, just as Esav hated Yaakov. So the argument is, all of the children of Leah, all of the tribes that sold Yosef into slavery, represent the power of hatred. And therefore they are vulnerable. Since they exhibited hatred to their brother, they are vulnerable to the hatred from their brother, Esav. It is only Yosef and Binyamin who elevated. Binyamin, of course, was not involved in Mechiras Yosef, and Yosef was the victim. So they were free of this taint of hatred. Therefore, they are immune from the power of hatred that Amalek represents. Right? This is the idea. So these are three different reasons why the Malchus had to go to Shaul first before it could go to David. And the Haftorah tells us that there was a Chidush HaMlucha, there needed to be an official coronation ceremony. The other thing that's interesting, again, we'll talk about it more when we talk about Amalek in greater detail, that is, when Shmuel says to Shaul, why did you not carry out the order? So at one point Shaul says, I was afraid of the people and I listened to them. They wanted me to spare the sheep. So says Shaul, and I listened to them. And that itself is very, very telling, because what Shmuel essentially tells Shaul is that one of the qualities of leadership, you of course have to listen to people, of course that's so, but there needs to be a fearlessness. You cannot be afraid to do the right thing because it'll make you unpopular. This is a famous, again, I don't know why political science associations are coming to me tonight, but you may have read at one point in your life a very, very famous letter written by Edmund Burke, who was a great, great member of Parliament in the 19th century. And Burke was writing a letter to a constituent. He was elected from a district in which a constituent said that you better vote a certain way or people are going to vote you out of office or whatever it is. And Burke wrote a very, very interesting letter. It's really a classic in political philosophy, in which he says a representative job is not to vote the way the people want him to vote, but it's to vote based on his judgment of what is best for the people. And that might not be exactly what they want. They may be uninformed, and even though why is my judgment better than their judgment? He says, well, that's the nature of a republic, of an election, meaning to say that I was elected because of my judgment, because of my skill. I must use my judgment to make a decision of what I believe is best for the nation or best for the people, and it is not simply to automatically respond to whatever you happen to want. Now, that doesn't mean you'll lose the next election. That does mean that. And you don't necessarily squander it on minor things. But certainly, on major things, your job is to use your judgment and not necessarily simply follow their judgment. There's a very famous vort from Rabbi Salanter. The Mishnah at the end, well, let's end with this. The Mishnah at the end of Maseches Sotah talks about the different signs before Mashiach comes, the birth pains of Mashiach, how difficult it'll be, and everything, economic pressure and terrorism and youth culture where the youth will despise, the aged, and wisdom will be disregarded. So at the end it says, and the face of the generation will be like the face of a dog. It's a bit of an enigmatic expression. The face of the generation will be like a dog. What's the comparison? So Rabbi Salanter says, the face of a generation is a term for leadership, because they're the ones that look ahead, that give guidance, perspective. Now, what is a dog? So he says the following. You're walking your dog. So on one hand, your dog is always in front of you, but the dog is always looking back to see where you are. So he says that's what leadership is going to be before Mashiach comes. There will be leaders that's supposed to be ahead of us, but all they're doing is looking where we want to go. How does the expression go? You see which way the wind blows, and the like. And that's what politics often is, If 51% of people want abortion, the candidate will become pro-choice. If 51% don't want abortion, they'll become pro-life. Whatever the polls say is what people all of a sudden believe in, right? And that's what Rabbi Salanter says. A leader cannot just follow what people want. A leader must be fearless. And this is what Shmuel tells Shaul. What do you mean you were afraid of the people? You thought you would become unpopular. You have to do what's right, even when it's not popular. There is an interesting din. There's a din that if an animal falls off a wall, let's say a chicken falls off a wall, so lahalacha, we are choshesh, we are afraid of a skeletal dislocation, and the animal is halachically a treifa. You cannot check it anymore because the skeleton may have gotten dislocated. But it's brought down if you put the animal in water, assuming it can swim, and it's a swimming animal, like a goat or whatever it would be, so swimming is a sign that it's healthy and you could check it. I always think the animal never wins, meaning if it's not healthy, it drowns, and if it's healthy, it's going to be shechted. But okay. So then the Shulchan Aruch says the following obvious qualification. When is swimming a sign of health? If it is swimming against the current. But if it's just swimming in the direction of the current, that proves nothing, because even a dead fish will move with a moving current. And the Bali Musar say this is a metaphor for what it means to be spiritually alive. And that is, when you go against the current, that shows that you're a vital person who is thinking about life. If you go with the current, it doesn't mean anything, because even a person that's dead can be carried with the current. And certainly with the leader, that's a very, very important thing. And again, I bring this up because sometimes we have to realize even religious leaders are sometimes on some level terrorized. I don't mean literally, sometimes literally, most of the time not literally, but figuratively, they are terrorized by the unreasonableness of their followers, who will not allow the leaders to espouse positions that the leaders themselves believe. Again, I'm getting in too much trouble tonight, but this is the idea, that sometimes that's a problem even in the Torah community itself, where there are Gedolim who would want to be much, much greater voices of moderation. But they will say, I can't make certain statements, I can't do certain things, because my followers will attack me and will simply, not listen to anything that I say. And that's kind of going back to the Musar that Shmuel gave Shaul HaMelech, that you got to take a stand. Okay, you all have a good week. Good Shabbos.